Today we're going to talk about the Han Dynasty, which is probably the most historically significant dynasty in Chinese history. It is the dynasty that, more than any other, shaped what it means to be Chinese, shaped Chinese cultural values, and established the patterns that we will see for the next 1800 years. So this is critical in understanding Chinese culture, Chinese values, and really the development of the entire East Asia region, because this is absolutely significant for Korea, for Japan, for Vietnam, and for other societies as well. The Han Dynasty is the longest lasting imperial dynasty that maintained control for the entirety of its existence. It is the first dynasty to control all of China proper. It is the first dynasty to implement Han Chinese rule over non-Chinese peoples as well. So we have a peak of cultural sophistication, cultural spread, imperial rule. All the dynamics that we see in the Roman Empire in the West existed in the East under the Han Dynasty. But unlike the Roman Empire, which disintegrated and split, and would ultimately its constituent parts would become the Italian nation, the French nation, the Spanish nation, the British nation, right? The Han Dynasty would eventually come back together after its collapse. And it would be under the Han Dynasty that up to this point, Chinese civilization reached its apogee. It would be under the Han that Chinese writing systems would spread throughout East Asia. Chinese cultural norms, Confucian ideology, and governmental systems would become commonplace in this entire region of the globe. So to understand the Han Dynasty, why it's so historically relevant, and what all it came to represent, we have to look at the dynasty that came before, the Qin. As we recall from last time, the Qin had very harsh policies of rewards and punishments. The Qin emperor ruled with an iron fist to the point to where, towards the end of Qin Shi Huangdi's life, poisoned by mercury in an attempt to cheat death and live forever, he ends up actually attempting to order the waves to stop coming into the shore, right? And has his servants flog the ocean. So we can see an example of his megalomania. We also can see in the army of terracotta warriors that he created that were supposed to come to life and guard his body after his death, in which he would rule in the afterlife. It's clear that in the Qin dynasty, the ruler ruled not with the consent of the governed, not on behalf of the governed, but on behalf of his own power. And that was legalist philosophy. And the strict legalist system of rewards and punishments would be what ultimately undid the Qin dynasty. After the death of the first emperor, the eldest son, who was seen as more willful and more of a strong leader, ended up committing suicide, and it's been speculated that he ended his life due to a false order forged by a minister who believed his younger brother would be much easier to control. Well, when this younger brother took the throne, the system remained unchanged. When a group of laborers under Chen Sheng and Wu Guang moved to the north to Yuyang for a government job, they were delayed by a thunderstorm. So they were leading this body of peasant soldiers, these conscripts. They were delayed by this thunderstorm. They knew they would not arrive at the work site on time, the punishment for which was death, regardless of the reason. So Chen Sheng and Wu Guang figured, hey, we're going to be put to death. We might as well cast our lot with fortune and rebel and see what happens, because we're doomed either way, right? So they rebelled. Their rebellion was ultimately defeated, but they helped to bring the Qin dynasty down, after which you had a number of warlords vying for power. Two of these warlords, the dominant winners of this contest among warlords, were a man named Liu Bang and another named Xiang Yu. Xiang Yu, the second of these warlords, was a great nobleman. He was very physically powerful. He was a great commander, a brilliant tactician, and he won battle after battle after battle. His enemy, Liu Bang, ultimately defeated him, despite the fact that Liu Bang lost almost every battle he fought against Xiang Yu. So, how did Liu Bang overcome Xiang Yu in what was called the Chu-Han contention? Xiang Yu called his dynasty the Chu. Liu Bang would call his dynasty the Han. And they fought a civil war for control of the collapsing Qin Empire. Liu Bang ended up defeating Xiang Yu because despite the fact that he was a peasant who didn't have a lot of military experience, was not so skilled at commanding soldiers, he was very good at leading people. He was very generous. He was very merciful to the common people due to the fact that he himself had peasant origins. This endeared him to the common people. He understood their struggles, and he endeavored to be generous whenever possible. On top of this, he rewarded his generals with better than he rewarded himself. Right? So he earned their loyalty over time. He had begun as a simple magistrate in a region called Hanjun, which is why we call it the Han Dynasty. And he eventually gained massive amounts of strength despite losing battle after battle because of the fact that people saw in him a moral solution to the problems posed by the Qin dynasty. Xiang Yu was a brilliant general, but he didn't offer any kind of social change, and he didn't appeal to the emotions and to the ideals of the population the way that Liu Bang did. So even though Liu Bang was losing battle after battle, he kept gaining supporters, and eventually Xiang Yu lost his first battle, which was the one where he was ultimately defeated and had to commit suicide. So Liu Bang ends up overtaking Xiang Yu and establishing the Han Dynasty, and it will be the House of Liu, romanized as Liu, that would be the imperial family for a 400-year period, which is one reason that that's probably the single most prestigious surname in Chinese culture, just simply due to the fact that this prominent dynasty was ruled by this clan. So after Liu Bang, the supreme ancestor of the Han imperial line, reestablishes unity throughout the empire, he begins to promote Confucian scholars to positions of government. Now, he still has some legalist beliefs that he carries with him, but the dominant tenor of his dynasty is going to be the promotion of Confucianism and governance through Confucianist principles. For example, promoting officials based on whether they showed filial piety, whether or not they were caring towards their parents or grandparents, rewarding people based on righteousness, their personal moral behavior, right, rather than necessarily whether or not they would be better at extracting wealth from the population. On top of this, the Han Dynasty maintained, at the very least, a superficial concern for the welfare of the peasantry. In fact, many of the rulers throughout the Han Dynasty would have deep concern for the betterment, the prosperity of the average person. And Liu Bang certainly had marketed himself as such, and in fact, life did get better under his rule, because one of the first things he did when he became emperor is he dramatically slashed taxes. So he reduced the tax burden on the population. He reduced the amount of labor that they would have to provide the state every year, and he reduced some of the harsh punishments, making sure that the government was not it wasn't an undue burden on the people. And this was in line with the teaching of the Confucian scholars, of the literati. He also promoted farming so that the population would be able to feed itself, valuing farmers over trade. He allowed for the publication of philosophical texts. He promoted Confucianism throughout the provinces. So Confucianists went from being this despised minority who were chased around and buried alive and their works burned to having the ear of the emperor himself. And of course, the fact that Liu Bang rose from the most humble of beginnings as a farming peasant to the emperor is something that has been celebrated by Chinese culture to this very day. And he's a great culture hero for that reason. Liu Bang established his capital at Chang'an, which is one of the world's one of the greatest cities of antiquity. In about 150 BC, we're looking at about 350,000 people, a very large population. Chang'an was not just the political center of China, it was the center of trade for all of Asia. So we are already establishing the Silk Road. Goods are being produced in China, silk, tea, later on porcelain, and they're being exported west along the Silk Road from through the Middle East into Europe, into the Roman Empire. Chang'an was kind of the capital of the Silk Road. It was where the goods that were produced were shipped west. So a massive amount of wealth flowed into the city. On top of this, you had people from many different parts of the world there. There were inscriptions of Jews. When we get into the 2nd century AD, you'll see Christian inscriptions found on buildings at Chang'an. There were Arabs there. There were people from throughout southeastern and northeastern Asia who migrated there. Right? So there were even people called the Tocharians, an Indo-European group that lived in Western China proper, who now no longer exist, who had representatives at Chang'an. One of the reasons for this is that the Han Dynasty established what we call the tributary system. The tributary system was a system in which foreign rulers, chieftains, people whose, for example, the ancestors of the modern Thai people, eventually the chieftains of the tribes in what's now Japan, they would send emissaries to China, and they would meet the Chinese emperor. They'd be given gifts and titles and acknowledgement by the Chinese emperor in exchange for them paying homage to the Chinese emperor. So they would be able to return to their lands with the treasures and the gifts from the emperor of China that would legitimize their rule among their peers, right? And in exchange, the Chinese emperor would receive kind of nominal acceptance of his rule, right? And this is the system that would eventually, when we get to the Wu Kingdom and the Three Kings period, we'll see contact with Japan and other parts of Asia. But this was established first by Liu Bang. And Chang'an was also useful because of its location. The emperor had to keep a large army at court in order to maintain control over the government. The problem was that the Great Wall also had to be maintained so that China could defend its borders. The location of the court at Chang'an kind of killed two birds with one stone. He kept a large army at a central location, and he could police both the court as well as the northwestern and northeastern frontiers at the same time. So it was a very flexible location for the emperor to station large numbers of troops. Liu Bang's reforms would have a lasting impact throughout the rest of the dynasty. First of all, as I stated earlier, he dramatically lowered the tax burden on the peasants. On top of this, he lowered the amount of corvée labor they would have to perform for the state every year. He complicated things for his successors, though, by handing out large parcels of land to his followers. In particular, he would give his major followers feudal estates in which they would have entire populations they controlled, and they would owe him allegiance, and he would be able to call on them, and they would call up armies from their own estates. So you end up with these kind of states within the state in all of these feudal estates owned by Liu Bang's supporters, right? So we start to see a feudal system spread again throughout Imperial China. Now, most of the land was under the emperor's control and very centralized, but large chunks of land were given to these generals and relatives who had supported them. And eventually, you'll end up with a situation where the threat of rebellion from these quasi-independent territories was very real, right? And the emperors ultimately had to take these lands away from the successors of Liu Bang's followers. But nonetheless, the Han Dynasty government was seen as benevolent, as largely merciful towards the people, and very paternalistic. Because the government had earned or regained the trust of the people and was seen as possessing a, a moral superiority to all other authority, the state was seen as legitimate by the vast majority of the population, and this allowed the Han Dynasty to expand further and further south every year, and ultimately created peaceful internal conditions in which the economy grew at an astounding rate. In fact, you could make the argument that it wouldn't even be until the 19th century with the settlement of the western United States that economic growth reached the same level again in human history, given the sheer amount of land being put under cultivation, the sheer amount of productivity that was occurring. I want to make a note right quick about personal, regnal, and posthumous names. So the emperors, like all people, have their personal names. In the case of Liu Bang, he has his family name, Liu, romanized as Liu, and his given name, Bang, romanized as Bang. He took the regnal title of Emperor Gao, romanized as Gao, which means exalted. After he died, the word Zhu, which is romanized as Zu, was added to his regnal title, and Zhu means ancestor, right? So high exalted ancestor. We usually translate it in English as supreme ancestor. There are only two major emperors to receive this title of Gaozi. That's Liu Bang and the founder of the Dong Dynasty, Li Yuan, who would receive the title of Dong Gaozi after his death. He founded the Dong Dynasty, which is the second most influential dynasty in Chinese history. The founders of later dynasties, like for example, Zhu Guangzhong, the founder of the Ming Dynasty, he would receive the name of Ming Daizi after his death, right? Daizi meaning grand ancestor, right? So it's a little bit of a step below what was afforded to Li Bang. Right? I just wanted to clear that up because you'll see that term, emperor, what looks like Emperor Gaozu, right, in English, right? So I just wanted to clear up what those names meant for future reference. Liu Bang set a good example for his successors. He attempted to live relatively simply. He had harmony within the imperial dynasty for the most part. And we'll learn why for the most part in a moment. And he generally devoted himself to governing the land well. He ended up being defeated by the Xiongnu towards the end of his life. The Xiongnu were, from the Chinese perspective, a barbarian tribe north of the Great Wall, the ancestors of the people we later identify as the Mongols. Some historians and anthropologists, and I tend to agree with this, identify the Xiongnu with the Huns, who would later migrate west and invade the Roman Empire in the 4th century. The 4th century AD, rather, so very far in the future. Very militarily capable people who follow around flocks of sheep from watering hole to watering hole and are very, very militaristic, very dominant at cavalry warfare. So a major threat to China, and one of the reasons that the Great Wall was built. They were the people that the Great Wall was meant to keep out. Liu Bang ended up aggressively pursuing them. He was defeated, but the empire survived. It wasn't the kind of catastrophe that destroyed the state, in part due to the fact that he had a very solid foundation for his government. When he died, he was succeeded by his son, Liu Ying, but the real power was held by his wife, the Empress Liu. Liu Ying took the name Emperor Hui, and he was very much a mama's boy. I don't say that to disparage him. The events of his life pretty much bore this out. His mother, the Empress Liu, Liu Jie, was a very strong-willed aristocratic woman who had been with Liu Bang since the beginning of his career. One of the reasons that Liu Bang was able to rise from the role of a peasant to a magistrate was his union with his wife, who was herself a very effective leader. When Liu Bang died, she held the real power. Her son, Emperor Hui, he had a very weak constitution, and in many instances, he was kind of dismayed by what he saw as his mother's great cruelty and strictness. So, I will give an example of her great cruelty. We don't know if this is a 100% factual occurrence. The empress had many enemies, and some of those enemies are later historians, because in the Confucian tradition, when women hold power, it's generally seen as a sign of dynastic weakness and immorality. The reason that women are able to hold power is because the men are weak, the men lack morals, the men are easily misled and swayed. So when you have a regency where a woman is effectively governing the empire, from a Confucian standpoint, that's already a source of chaos. Right? So we don't know how much she was being maligned by future historians and how much was true. We do know that in dynasty after dynasty after dynasty, these emperors would have hundreds of women in some instances. There would be a lot of competition, a lot of jealousy, and a lot of violence between them, particularly when it came to whose son would inherit what. Right? So in the case of Empress Liu, she was the wife of the emperor. The others were his concubines, meaning that even if they had an older son than her son would have had the priority for the throne because she was his legal wife. But on top of that, her son was actually Liu Bang's oldest son, Liu Ying. And Liu Bang didn't favor Liu Ying because he saw Liu Ying as being very weak, kind of effeminate, unfit to lead, not serious. And so he wanted to give the throne to a son by one of his concubines, concubine Qi. Her son was named Liu Ruyi, right? And Liu Ruyi was much younger than his son by his older wife. Liu Bang really favored concubine Qi while he was alive. They would play different board games together. They would play music together and go on long trips. They would go on these very long boat rides. So Empress Liu had it out for concubine Qi, both due to the threat to her own son's succession to the throne and out of personal spite. We don't know the truth, the full truth of this account. For many Chinese historians throughout the centuries, a regency by a woman was seen as automatically a sign of immorality in the dynasty, as the natural order being out of whack. So we don't know how much was the truth about her cruelty and how much was simply the bias of later historians needing to condemn her. Nonetheless, we do know that she had concubine Qi murdered. The controversial, well, I won't say controversial, the element that we're not so sure about is the account of her murder. So concubine Qi was very beautiful. That's how she won over the heart of Liu Bang. And Empress Liu, because of her great beauty, decided to disfigure her. She had her guards force concubine Qi to drink a potion that made her mute. She could only let out grunts. These guards also cut off concubine Qi's nose, cut off her ears, cut out her tongue, and cut off her arms and legs. So she was basically a torso, and they threw her into a pigsty with other pigs, and a sign was placed on the pigsty that said, "Human swine." So this, she was also blinded, I forgot to mention. So this blinded woman with her ears chopped off, her nose chopped off, her arms and legs chopped off, her tongue cut out, and then made mute by a potion. she's dying in this pigsty as a pig. Well, Empress Lu's son, Liu Ying, Emperor Hui, walked by and saw what was going on, and it, according to the grand historian Suna Qian, it shocked him so grotesquely that he retreated from government. He decided he was never going to try to compete with his mother for power. He was going to let her be the regent and call all the shots. He was going to sit in the palace and drink with his concubines and enjoy his dinners and enjoy the fruits of being emperor without concerning himself with the world. And chances are that this account is true due to the fact that he died at the young age of 22, likely due to a very dissolute lifestyle. And that's the case for many emperors who attempt to retreat from the burden of ruling, often during periods of great strife. Empress Lu had concubine Qi's son, Liu Ruyi, assassinated. The assassin shoved poison down the 12-year-old boy's throat. She also had several other sons of Liu Bang assassinated, as well as several prominent high-ranking generals whom she believed threatened her power. So Chinese historians do not look fondly on what they call the Lu disturbance. After Emperor Wan takes the throne, a much older son of Liu Bang, who eventually succeeds. After her 22-year-old son dies, Empress Lu attempts to put two small children on the throne, and she's temporarily successful, but they end up dying very young. As a result, another son of Liu Bang ends up taking control after her death. And after her death, her entire family is purged from government. She appointed many of her male relatives from the Liu clan to high-ranking positions in the government. They and all of their descendants are exterminated. Right? And this is something that you'll see throughout Chinese history, in which you have punishment to the 3 degrees. 3 degrees up and 3 degrees down from the perpetrator. So if you commit a crime, your parents and grandparents are punished. Your children and grandchildren are punished. Right? So that's how justice was dealt out in this collectivistic, family-centered, family-focused society. The last thing I'm going to talk about on this particular video, and this topic will be continued in another video, I don't want these videos to get too long, is the rule of Wan and Jing. So after Empress Lu's death, Emperor Wan succeeds to the throne. Emperor Wan, whose given name was Liu Hong, ended up creating a great period of stability, stabilizing the chaos that erupted with the death of Empress Lu, and transformed the Han economy into a massive powerhouse. The way that he did this is he took Confucian principles regarding economics and applied them to government. The Confucianists argued that, and again, this is another debate in Chinese history that is kind of mirrored by contemporary politics in modern states, which should show you how technologically and governmentally advanced ancient China was. The Confucianists believed that if the government taxed people less, the people would keep more of their wealth. Because they're keeping more of their wealth, they will work harder. They will reinvest their wealth into their own farms and businesses, and there will be kind of a snowball effect of prosperity. So Emperor Wan first lived a very basic, humble lifestyle. He ate plain food. He wore humble clothing. He insisted that the women at court wear humble clothing, very humble jewelry, and he saved a massive amount of funds. After he saved a massive amount of funds, he slashed taxes from 1/10, which is what Liu Bang had made the tax rate. It had been 6/10 under the Qin. Liu Bang slashed it down to 1/10. Emperor Wan slashed it to 1/30. So about 3.3% of a peasant's property would go towards taxation. This meant that the vast majority of what peasants grew, they kept for themselves. The end result was an economic explosion. Peasants began to expand new lands under cultivation. They began to clear forests, drain swamplands on their own initiative. A animal husbandry, the amount of animal husbandry in the provinces skyrocketed, and the end result was that even though Emperor One had slashed the taxes dramatically from 1/10 to 1/30th, the state granaries were overflowing with grain, overflowing with meat. The farmers generally paid their taxes in kind. The end result was that there was so much food that was produced that the government ended up giving a lot of it back to the people because otherwise it was going to rot. So ironically, by the end of his reign, he was living in a very lavish, lofty palace with his concubines dressed in silk robes, precisely because of the great wealth that had been developed due to his very mild taxation policy. His son, Liu Qi, who would succeed him as Emperor Jing, slashed taxes even further to 1 out of 60. Right? So the vast majority, almost all of what a peasant produced would be kept by that same peasant for the family's use later on. Yet, just like with Emperor One slashing taxes, the end result was an economic boom that completely transformed the country to the point to where it was considered commonplace for peasants to have many pigs, many chickens, large amounts of land under cultivation, sometimes even silk clothing for the elderly who kind of had pride of place in the family in this Confucian society. So the empire prospered and the population exploded as a result. So with this unprecedented economic growth, unprecedented population growth, the power of the state swelled. The empire's coffers were full. The government had more money than what it knew what to do with. And the Chinese economy became head and shoulders above every other economy on earth, including the Roman economy at the time. Now, this golden age would not last forever, in part due to the actions of Emperor Jing's son, Emperor Wu, and we're going to talk about him more in the next video. But this golden age in which Emperors Wan and Jing ruled is called the Age of Wan and Jing. This era in which these very wise, very moral Confucian emperors ruled with the welfare of the people paramount as their paramount priority. There was very little interference from great nobles. The feudal estates that had been created by Liu Bang were pacified. There was a lot of harmony within most of society. So you start to see new lands cleared as the Han population moves south. And of course, they're displacing non-Chinese peoples as they go. They're both displacing and absorbing them. Right? They're displacing, exterminating, and absorbing them in different areas, right, at different times, like with most imperial growth, the same kind of situation with ancient Rome or ancient Persia. So by the end of Emperor Jing's reign, the Han Chinese state is ready to kind of flex its muscles and exert itself on the international stage. And we're going to talk more about that in the next video. Thanks.